Hello, once again, Eric Martin from Lewis Clark State College, and we're talking about History 101, And we're looking at another setup for Chapter 12 of Worlds of History, looking at the causes and the effects of the Black Death. So doing a little bit of a combination of history, well, not medical history is really what we're doing, which is a realm of history that you might not have thought about. And I know that there are some of you in the class that are pre-nursing majors, and maybe this is a way of combining your interests with nursing with history. And we have a couple of secondary sources and a wide variety of primary sources, really focusing in on the period in the mid-14th century, 1346 to 1350, looking at the initial outbreak of the Black Plague in Europe. Now, a few things that I want you to be on the lookout for while you do this. The first thing is, in that Mark Wheelis document, find out who he is, because he's not a historian by training, but he's done some really cool historical work. So I think it'd be useful for you to find out who he is and why he got interested in the Black Plague. Now, as you get into his document, just a few things to keep in mind. That secondary source is directly connected to the very first primary source that you're going to encounter by Gabriele de Mussis. My Italian's pretty bad. Anyway, in this de Mussis piece, de Mussis, his account of the Black Plague is fundamental for our understanding of the origins of the plague. So basically, whenever you encounter a history work focusing on the Black Plague, they're going to begin with the de Mussis piece, right? So it's important for you to take a good look at that piece, the secondary source, the primary source, and then look at the Wheelis document, because the de Mussis piece plays a big part in the document, because he's making this argument, right? Wheelis is putting together a pretty good argument, or at least a pretty good example of what an argument could look like, basically around the idea of where did the Black Plague come from. So there is a siege by the Mongols on a Black Sea port, the city of Kaffa. The Mongols engage in biological warfare, and then the question becomes, was it through this biological warfare that the plague enters Western Europe, or was it through something else? So I don't want to give it away. De Mussis makes the argument that it is the Mongols who bring the plague to Europe through this attack. And Wheelis kind of confirms that, but then puts a twist on it. All right, so I want you to pay attention for that. Okay. The next piece by Giovanni Basio is a part of a book in which people are telling stories during the plague, and so you get some flavor about what's happening during the plague. Pay attention to things like, what are the symptoms of the plague? How does it occur? But the real thing to pay attention to, in my opinion anyway, in that document is, what are some of the impacts of the Black Plague to the society at large? How's it playing out? What's happening as a result of this thing? So that document is really good for this. And then we get these images of the Black Death that I think would be useful for y'all to take a good look at and see if you can pull some kind of analysis out of it. The last two documents in the chapter both focus on what happens in the Islamic world with the plague. Now, we know a lot about what happens in Western Europe with the plague, and it's pretty well documented. Population drops anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2, depending on where you're at in the numbers. And in the Islamic world, it's very similar. What we don't know as much about is what happens in China or India. The assumption is that the death toll is roughly the same in China or India. However, the historical documentation is lacking to demonstrate that. And frankly, I don't know enough about the historians working on the Black Plague in India or in China to tell you why that is, whether it is a lack of primary sources or a lack of people who are interested in the plague, but they could also read medieval Chinese, medieval Hindi. I don't know. But the assumption is that it is as catastrophic in East Asia, but it's just an assumption, right? Anyway, back to the Islamic world. The Ahmad al-Makrizi document, he really focuses on what happens in the city of Cairo when it gets hit by the plague. So read that source and compare it to the two Italian sources that you've already read, both in terms of tone. All right, they both have religious overtones, but it seems that maybe the religious overtones are slightly different. All right, so keep in mind the religious overtones part, but then also keep in mind things like the specifics. What kind of things do each author say is happening as a result of this catastrophe? And then finally, we have one more secondary source by Michael Doles, where he's really looking at the comparison to the responses to the plague in Muslim communities and Christian communities. And so on one hand, he spells it all out for you in the document. Here are some of the things the Christians did. Here are some of the things Muslims did. Here are some of the ways it's similar. Here are some of the ways it's different. But we also have these primary sources where y'all can go through that and see if you can add some things to it. But one of the questions that I have for you on the discussion boards is to decide whether or not the responses by Christians and Muslims to the plague were mostly alike or mostly different, and to use some specific examples to illustrate your points. And maybe they're mostly alike in certain areas and dramatically different in others. Maybe that's another way to think about this. I've got other questions for you set up in the discussion board, so be sure to read through that. But the final question is going to be, do you think that looking at medical history, medieval medical history, has any kind of relevance for the 21st century? And we ought to be able to get some mileage out of that, right? So that's all I've got for you today. Do your readings carefully. This stuff is fun if you're into, gloom and doom. But it's interesting. It's typically a topic that we've heard of but don't know very much about. For those of y'all who purchased the Bentley book, as you were required to, read the material on the Black Plague. That'll give you some more context for this. I know I haven't done a very good job of emphasizing that you're supposed to be reading that Bentley book in conjunction with the Worlds of History book, but that's always been the intention. I've assumed you have been. We all know what happens with assumptions, right? Anyway, that's what I got for you today. If you have any questions, you feel free to give me a call here at the office, send me an email, drop by the office, and enjoy your historical studies.